We've been covering sprint planning in my last video, and today's video, my goal is to cover some mistakes and anti-patterns that I've done in the past and also that I'll continue to observe in some of the Scrum team that they do during sprint planning. And hopefully, after we go over all these some anti-patterns that you might notice or you might maybe yourself be guilty of during sprint planning as a Scrum Master, hopefully you will stop doing them. Sprint planning anti-patterns. Welcome back to Aisha Scrum. I'm very happy to have you all join my platform. For my current subscribers and my new subscribers, I welcome you all to my channel. So let's get into the video. My goal today is to cover some mistakes, anti-patterns, behaviors that sometimes we Scrum Masters do it, and sometimes product owners, sometimes the development team themselves are guilty of when it comes to sprint planning or things that we might do during or as soon as the sprints are just get started. Number one I have in my board is not aligning the product vision, the product goal to our team's sprint backlog. So what I mean by this is that, so I know sometimes like when we do plan, we go to sprint planning, we are just discussing, okay, this is the next stories we have to work on, this is the next future. We come Scrum team to always go back to their why, right? Always go back to the purpose. Why are we even meeting in the first place? Why are we together today discussing what we're going to be planning to deliver next for our stakeholders and also our end users? I know that during PI planning, we plan to cover the stories, but what will that lead to at the end of us completing the sprint? Are we going to be closer to completing the future? Or are we going to be closer to completing the epic? Or is it part of the next release or the next deliverable that we're supposed to do as a team? So that conversation we have to always discuss and ensure that we are not just pulling stories from the product backlog and pulling it to the sprint backlog, but we are actually pulling stories that will meet our sprint goal, and our sprint goal will also correlate with our product goal. So that's something that's very important that we might have to sometimes remind the product owner if they are not familiar with that as Scrum Masters, or with Scrum Masters also asking this question during this session. That's something that's very, very important. And sometimes another mistakes and anti-patterns that I see is that, like for example, companies that are doing safe, right? During PI planning, they'll plan for sprint to sprint, right? In some cases, some people plan basically for the whole PI. We all know it's best to at least plan for 2 to 3 sprints, not at 100%, but at least at 80 or 70%. So that in case you have your feedback from your sprint review, you'll use those feedback and readjust your backlog. And I'll see some teams who basically will come together. Let's say they're in sprint 1 in PI 1, and they already have story planned for sprint 2. They will just say, okay, we already went over the story, so now let's just start our sprint. That's an anti-pattern. We always have to go over everything in that backlog just to ensure that any changes, any feedback we've got from sprint 1, it also will reflect in sprint 2. Not because during PI planning, we've stated that this is what we're going to be doing, this is the plan we have, then you just want to follow through the plan without ensuring that the plan also relates and correlates with the value that we plan to deliver at the end of the PI itself. So at every given point, at all time during sprint planning, we have to ensure that we go over everything in that sprint, even though the work have already been planned for during PI planning. So that was the number one item I had. So the next thing I have in my board is not addressing availability despite using average velocity. And these anti-patterns, I'm actually mentioning it for teams that do relative estimates, meaning that they use their average velocity to help them determine the next workload they'll plan in a sprint. It is true, sometimes we'll add multiple sprints and get our average, then we'll use that average to now plan for this new sprint that's about to start. Despite having your average velocity, it's still very important to discuss availability and holidays, onshore holiday, offshore holidays, any vacation time, even though like, oh yeah, because one time I had a Scrum Master that made the comment to me like, oh Aisha, my team average velocity is this number, I forgot the exact number, but they gave me the number and we just basically planned for that. I was like, okay, but we had July 4th on this day. Did you also consider that? Oh yeah, I just felt like since I took 5 sprints and planned for that average velocity, that for using that average velocity of that 5 sprints, they might as well just use that to plan. I was like, yeah, it is true that's your average velocity, but you also have to ensure that you went over availability with the team. Even though that's your average velocity that will help you determine your work, we have to ensure that at least you are not over committing by ensuring that you have people that will work. Because sometimes your average velocity, we all know that will fluctuate, right? Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's middle. It doesn't make sense for your average velocity to always remain the same, because we constantly want to improve, we constantly want to grow as a team, we constantly want to get better. So in that case, even you have a number that you've already calculated, you should still verbally communicate with the team. So not doing that during sprint planning or even prior to planning, that's an anti-pattern. By the way, if you've been finding my content valuable, like and subscribe to my channel. I really will appreciate it. And if you're interested in mentorship, do not hesitate to email me at admin@aishascrumtech.com. Alright, so let's go to the next anti-pattern I have in my board. So the next thing I have is not going over all of the spillover stories and just starting your sprint. And this is like a very common one I observe a lot, like where I see that team will have spillover, right? And they'll have spillover. Hopefully you already know what spillover is. If not, I have a lot of videos already on my channel about what is spillover and what causes spillover in Scrum teams. So check out those videos if you still have question about that. But if your Scrum team have a spillover, it's very important that not because it's a spillover, then it automatically have to be added to your new sprint that's about to start. It's very important that we go over all those stories and discuss why did we have spillover, just to ensure that the same mistake we had in this sprint that just closed, we will have that same mistake in this sprint that's about to start. Not because a user story or anything that you had in that spillover, it is spillover, then automatically you must put it in the next sprint. We all know at all given time, we have the product owner ensuring that we are working on stories that are the most important, right, in our backlog. And at the end of that, when the team work on it, at the end, we have some kind of value delivered to the end user. So at all time, we're going to prioritize value and outcome, like a very better outcome, over focusing on, oh, they didn't complete in this sprint, so they must complete in the next sprint. No, we have to have that conversation and determine what are we working on next. We had all these planned stories that we are working on, refining during backlog refinement, hoping that we can complete all of this potential spillover that just happened. Now that we have these spillovers, and now that we have already these semi-planned stories, which ones do we do first? And hopefully the product owner can answer this question. So it's very important for us to go over those spillover and the product owner can help us determine if that's also part of the next goal and the next story for us to deliver. Then we include it. And if it's not, do not include it in your sprint. Have it for the backlog, and when it's ready, we can work on it as a team. So the next thing I have in my board is not having sprint goal and purpose of the sprint, right? I know sometimes there's a huge controversy out there if a Scrum team should have sprint goal, if a Scrum team shouldn't have sprint goal. You all know that I'm very huge with ensuring that we have some kind of goal, right? Maybe you might not even call it a sprint goal. At least have some kind of purpose, like, okay, why are we meeting this sprint planning? What does the stakeholder want? What was the feedback from sprint review, in our last sprint review? What does the stakeholder want, and how can we ensure that in this sprint we're able to address some of those concerns? And also, what are some of those stories in this particular sprint that we have to ensure that we can meet before the sprint end? And if we must work on 5 stories in this sprint, what are those stories? So at least having those conversations can help you all know, okay, at this sprint we have to ensure that we complete this epic, or we have to complete this future. So everyone in the team will know that this is our goal, and we have to prioritize to ensure that we are able to meet and complete that. So that's why it's very nice to have sprint goals. So everyone has some kind of goal, and everyone are working together collaboratively and ensuring that we are able to meet that particular goal. So the next thing I have on my board is team members that are not participating in delivering the work, basically participating in estimation, meaning that people that are not doing the work, doing the estimates. Like, for example, Scrum Master should not be giving numbers or be giving estimates during sprint planning, right? We all know that the team members that are doing the work should be the one giving the estimate. And like, for example, product owner giving an estimate or questioning developers estimate, like, are you sure that's a 5? Because reading these stories, when I wrote these stories, I think these stories actually should be like a 2. That shouldn't be the product owner's opinion, shouldn't be the Scrum Master's opinion, Agile coach leadership management's opinion. When it comes to estimation, the developers that are doing the work or anyone that's doing the work should participate in the estimation. They should also tell or give a roughly estimate the effort of how long it's going to take them to do the particular work. So that's why it's important for the team that's doing the work to estimate the work. It's an anti-pattern for product owner, Scrum Master, BA that's not doing the work should be estimating for the development team. That's a huge anti-pattern for sure. The next thing I have in my board is starting sprints with the story not having estimates. Like, for example, we all know that it's a good practice, like regardless of the type of estimate your company use, it's a good practice to ensure that all the stories we have in our sprint backlog that's about to start, we should roughly estimate about the effort, the complexity it takes to complete that work. It's definitely an anti-pattern to have stories in your backlog and not having an estimate, and you, the Scrum Master, starting the sprint. That's something you have to ensure that one of our roles is to ensure that all the stories in the backlog basically have estimates. I'm not going to address if bug should have estimates, if a spike should have estimates, or if an enabler story should have estimates. That's basically going to be 100% up to your team or your company's policy. If your company do estimate bug, then you should also ensure that that bug tickets are estimated. If your company estimates spike, you have to also ensure that those spike stories are also estimated before starting the sprint. And if those things are not done and you started the sprint, that's an anti-pattern. So the next thing I have in my board is separating development tickets and separating the QA's tickets and having in your board. Basically, separating development stories from the quality analyst stories, like testing stories. I know like some of you be like, oh Aisha, that's waterfall, right? Well, you'll be surprised what out there. You'll be surprised how you see some teams that claim to be doing Agile. We basically will have a user story that's written only for development and a user story that will be written only for testing. And in Agile, we do not want to do that. We want to ensure that all time we write the user story that meets the end-to-end. And if you're not familiar with what I mean by end-to-end, watch my video about how to split user story. I was able to explain all of this in that video. If you watch that video, you will 100% understand what I mean by having a user story that meets the end-to-end. Having a user story just for development and having a user story just for testing, that's not the Agile way of working, right? And also having an estimate just for development and having an estimate just for testing, that's also not a good practice. But I know some of you will be like, oh Aisha, we're my company, we estimate in hours, we have to put an hours that will take the testers and you have to put an hours that will take the developer. Then for sure 100%, if your company do hours, then for sure you follow your company's policy, right? Then you must put those hours. But for a team that do relative estimates, they use basically story points and estimate based on the complexity, the effort it takes to do a particular work, we should not separate the estimates for development and separate the estimates for testing. What do we do? Can any of you guess what we actually do? Because if you watched my last video, I did stated that the team will come together and estimate either using the Agile Planning Poker or Agile Poker or Planning Poker. They will estimate developers, testers, whoever that's participating in doing the work will come together and estimate a user story that meets the end-to-end. They all will contribute and have a conversation until they come to consensus and now give that story the estimates. But we can't just say, oh, QA, what do you all think about this story? Developers, what do you all think about this story? That's not how we facilitate those sessions. We have to ensure that we are actually reading the user story and reading the acceptance criteria and then ask the overall team to give their number and voting anonymously. And if you watch my sprint planning Jira video that I did, that I demoed all of this will 100% help you all to know what am I even explaining. If in case for some of you that don't watch my video, I know some of you that are watching my platform, we are all very new to Agile. Some of you are thinking about transitioning to Agile. So in case that's why I'm making such comments for sure. And by the way, if you all have been doing things, some of these things that I've been calling anti-patterns, if that's something that you actually practice at work, is something that's actually valuable to you at work, and it's not an anti-pattern, please let me know in your comments, because I truly would like to also know what you all are doing differently out there. Just comment down below. The next thing I have in my board is pull story to the sprint backlog without meeting definition of ready. This is something I've been talking about in my last video in definition of ready. I addressed this to ensure that a team should have a definition of ready, because this definition of ready will ensure that we have to prevent any blockers, any issue that will ensure that we are actually only pulling stories that meet our definition of ready, so we can be able to complete it in the particular sprint. So not having a story meeting the definition of ready before putting it in, that's also one of the mistakes or anti-patterns that a Scrum Master, a Scrum team might do. So next thing I have in my board is changing estimates after sprint starting. I know some of you be like, oh, what? Really? Yes, because this is actually, I've seen this happen where I will start a sprint and then one person will be like, oh, by the way, I think that story shouldn't be a 5. It should have been an 8. Well, too bad. Because why? We've now started the sprint. So all this lesson learned, what we should have done, what we shouldn't have done, all this can be discussed in retro. So that's something for sure. If a developer tell me like, oh, Aisha, this particular story should have been an 8 and not 5, I'm like, oh, thank you very much for letting me know. I'm going to write that down and put it in my notes. We'll have a conversation about that during retrospective. So don't be that Scrum Master when the developer tell you that a story is going to be 8 and not a 5. You then go to Jira or your tool that you use at work and now change the estimate. That's an anti-pattern. We do not change estimate after a sprint start. After the sprint start, anything that happened afterwards, we can 100% discuss either in parking lots, we can also discuss anytime. But the actual change shouldn't happen, hopefully in the next sprint. That's why our sprint cycle is so short, right? So every next sprint, as we learn, we implement those new changes in the next sprint. Don't go back and start changing estimates. So that's another one. So the next thing I have is pulling story out of the sprint after the sprint starting. I know you all be like, okay, what? Pulling the story out, yes, that's also another anti-pattern, because sometimes people will start the sprint and later on the PO will be like, oh, by the way, oh, we can't work on this story anymore. Okay, thank you for letting us know. But hopefully it's something that you should already catch during backlog refinement or during sprint planning before the sprint starts. So if the sprint starts and the PO will be like, oh, well, something happened, because sometimes this is true, things can happen, right? This planning this sprint, not that it's going to be perfect and everything should be the same or remain the same. We expect some little switches that will happen throughout the duration of the sprint. But when a PO tells you that, oh, this story is not going to be worked on in this sprint anymore, oh, thank you so much for letting me know. I'm going to go there and put a notes on that and explain why. Oh, tell me why. Tell me why we can't complete this sprint in this story. This story in this sprint, I meant, right? And then let's say the PO will tell me, oh, Aisha, we can complete it due to so and so. Like, okay, fine. Could you put that in the notes? Then I will flag this story. And guess what I'm going to do? I'm just going to move this story if it's in progress. I'll just pull that story back to do. I'm not going to pull this story out of the sprint, because why? We already started our sprint. And one thing about Jira, I know about Jira for sure, is that it's going to tell you in the report that, oh, this story was pulled in the sprint, story that was removed outside the sprint. You're going to see that in your report. And one thing I don't like about taking out these stories is that on your burn down chart, as soon as you pull these stories out, it's going to give you false completion in your burn down chart. And if you don't know about how to interpret the burn down chart and all of that, watch my burn down chart video where I covered all these different ways how a line can go down. Pulling story out of the sprint after the sprint already started is also another way. Because the line will go down, and some of people that's outside looking at our board like, oh, this team is actually completing all their tasks, when in reality they're just basically just pulling stuff out. So that's why I don't think it's a good idea or a good habit for a team to get used to, whereby after the sprint start, they'll basically just go in, pull things, remove things, change things, add things. Yeah, I know some things at all time we can always add and change after the conversation within the team, but we shouldn't take our time and start pulling stuff out of the sprint. That's a huge anti-pattern for sure. So the next thing I have in my thing is planning sprints just for development and planning sprints just for testing. I know I covered the user story one, writing a story just for development, writing a story just for testing. I've also recently observed a team that basically was taking a whole sprint and just do only development. And they take the next 2 sprints and do only testing. That's still waterfall way of working. In Agile, we have to ensure at all time, even if it's like a small thing deliver, at the end, we should discuss create story that at the end we can demo to our stakeholder. Why do you all think I keep saying that that's an anti-pattern, right? It's an anti-pattern because at the end of that just development sprint, we have nothing to show to our stakeholders. And we have nothing to prove that we are able to learn in the next sprint. And at all time in Agile, we have to ensure that we are learning, we are want to foster continuous improvement and getting that feedback loop from our users. But if we take a whole sprint and plan just for development, we cannot demo that at the end, right? Because we all know that most stories and most coding we go through testing, except maybe some enabler stories that might not. But functional stories should not just be just for development in a sprint, because at the end of that sprint, we don't even have much to retrospect on. And at the end of that sprint, we might not even have a sprint review because we can't even demonstrate to the stakeholders what we actually was able to deliver. I can see how for testing that will come out good, because right at the end of that testing, then of course they were able to showcase what was done. But it's a good practice that even though it's going to be completing 10 development story in one sprint, you might as well just complete 5 development story and ensure that that same 5 story that's being developed are able to be tested in that sprint. Because at the end of the day, we will get more value out of those 5 by getting the feedback loop, unlike completing more, right? Outcome, value of outcome over output, right? So that thing is very, very important. So the next thing I have is assigning stories to developers without their permission. I don't think anyone have the rights in Agile or Scrum team whereby they will just assign tasks to developers or tech leads, say, oh, you get this, or you get that. I can see maybe like if we have like new team members in, even with that, you still will tell them like, oh, by the way, Aisha, I would like to assign this story to you. I know you newly just joined the team. This story will actually be a very good one for us to use in our KT sessions to learn, for us to learn, right? So I hope that's okay with you. Simple. We have to always be respectful, right? Going back to our Scrum values. That respect is very, very important. There's a reason why the Scrum Guide included respect, part of the Scrum values. So please don't just give tickets to someone just because they are contractors or they are offshore team members or they are quiet in the team. I think that's something that's not a good thing. And if you're a Scrum Master and you're observing that behavior, you should 100% speak up. And if you do not speak up, guess what? You are not being the shielder of your team and you are not championing your team members, some of those team members. So that's why it's very important for you to speak up if you notice those behavior. Always ask them. If you say they just assign it to that person, I've done this in the past. I'm like, oh, are you okay? Are you sure, comfortable doing the assignment? I know like so and so just assign this story to you. So then they will say something. Oh yeah, are you sure it's fine? Oh no, it's not. But we're going to talk on this offline, you know. Because sometimes some people feel like, why would you just tell me what to do? You know, when we are all professionals, so just ask and tell them, you know. And you too as a Scrum Master, you can definitely assign tasks as you are asking the team members, okay, who would like to work on this task? Or who is working on that task, you know. So don't just assign tasks without conversation. And if you do, that's an anti-pattern. So the next thing I have in my board is not responding to change and just following a plan, you know. Isn't that crazy? Did that ring a bell? Ding, ding, ding. That was part of going back to our Agile manifesto, right? Our Agile manifesto stated that we should always be responding to change over following a plan, right? It is true, we have to plan, right? People sometimes say, oh, Agile team do not plan. No, we do plan. We actually plan the hardest because we have backlog refinements, we have sprint planning, we have sometimes multiple backlog refinements, multiple sprint planning, health check, and all of those things. We do any planning more than any other processes out there, I would say for sure, because we constantly doing this every other day or even basically every 2 weeks in our sprint planning. So as much as we're doing all of this plan, we should also have the mindset that if some things that come in that's important, we should always be willing to take on it, right? It's an anti-pattern for a Scrum team that's not willing to basically respond to some change that the product owner deemed valuable to the end user and to the business. So some of this change should be responded to and also something be added to the sprint and hopefully ensure we had the conversation and we have people that will actually work on the stories. So not responding to this change, it's an anti-pattern. And the last thing I have in my board is not discussing releases and demo. I feel like sometimes we Scrum Master, we have to drive these conversations a lot, right, in a team during sprint planning. As the team are having this conversation, as the team are having all of this planning about what we are working on and all of that, we also have to discuss, okay, how we're going to be demoing this to the stakeholder. So whose stories and what that's part of going to be part of the demo, and also how are we ensuring that we are able to release it, or when are we going to be releasing this future? We ask all these questions. So at the end of the day, we have to ensure that we are not only doing our work, building these nice features. At the end, you should be able to get to the customer, right? To get to the end user, and also we'll foster that feedback loop whereby we can demo it to the stakeholders or the end user and get that feedback. I hope this little anti-patterns video have been so valuable to you all. If so, like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate it. And if you're interested in mentorship, do not hesitate to email me at admin@aishascrumtech.com. You can also check out our website online at www.aishatech.com. You can also call me at 484-767-1979. Thank you all for watching this sprint planning series. I really appreciate it all. Don't forget to watch my last sprint planning session and so my giraffe sprint planning video. See you again in the next session.